I'm Alina, 30 years old, and I'm the founder of a global tech logistics empire that handles more cargo than the city I was born in. But 12 years ago, I wasn't a CEO, and I certainly didn't feel like an empire builder. I was just a terrified girl standing in a kitchen that smelled of stale coffee and impending doom. My hand was trembling so violently that I had to grip the edge of the countertop just to keep upright. My father stood 3 feet away from me, and the silence between us was louder than the thunder rattling the window panes. He was holding the plastic stick I had foolishly left on the bathroom sink. I watched his eyes scan the two pink lines over and over again. His face wasn't sad. It was twisting into a shade of purple I had never seen before, a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. I felt the blood drain from my face. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, frantic and desperate. "Is this yours?" he asked. His voice was dangerously low, a growl that vibrated through the cheap linoleum floor. I couldn't find my voice to speak, so I just nodded. That single, tiny motion sealed my fate. I expected him to ask who the father was. I expected him to scream. I even foolishly hoped in the naive corner of my 18-year-old heart that he might hug me and tell me we would figure it out. He didn't offer a hug. He looked at me with eyes that had turned into absolute ice. "I knew it," he spat. He threw the pregnancy test onto the kitchen table like it was a piece of contaminated waste. "I knew you were rotten," he said, stepping closer to me. I shrank back, pressing my spine against the cold refrigerator. "You are a carbon copy of her, Alina," he hissed. The comparison hit me harder than a slap. He was talking about my mother. The woman who had abandoned us both when I was a toddler, the ghost that haunted every hallway of this house. To be compared to her was the ultimate sin in his eyes. "She was a mistake," he said, his voice rising now, cutting through me. "And now you're making another mistake." He looked at my stomach with pure disgust, as if I were carrying a disease rather than a life. "I won't have that history repeating under my roof. I won't raise another one of her failures." "Dad, please," I whispered, the tears finally spilling over hot and fast. "I can fix this. I can work. I won't be a burden." He didn't listen to a word I said. He turned on his heel and marched toward the hallway closet. I froze, paralyzed by fear and confusion. He returned 3 seconds later with my old gym duffel bag. It was empty and limp in his hands. He didn't tell me to pack. He didn't give me time to grab a coat or my toothbrush or the photo of my grandmother by my bed. He threw the bag at my chest. I caught it instinctively, clutching the canvas fabric like a shield. "Get out," he said. The command was simple, final, and terrifying. "Dad, it's raining," I pleaded, my voice cracking into a sob. "It's night time. I have nowhere to go." "You should have thought about that before you decided to become a whore like your mother," he shouted. He grabbed my arm. His fingers dug into my bicep hard enough to bruise, his grip like iron. I stumbled as he yanked me toward the front door. I tried to dig my heels into the floor, tried to resist, but I wasn't strong enough. He hauled me through the living room, dragging me past the life I had known for 18 years. He threw the front door open. The sound of the storm was immediate and overwhelming. Wind howled through the screen door and rain was coming down in torrential sheets, illuminated by the flickering street lamp outside. "Dad, please," I screamed, panic seizing my throat. He didn't look at me, he shoved me. It was a forceful, two-handed push squarely in the center of my back. I flew forward, tripping over the threshold. I landed hard on the wet concrete of the porch, scraping the skin off my palms. The cold was instantaneous. The freezing rain soaked through my thin t-shirt in seconds, plastering my hair to my face and chilling me to the bone. I scrambled to my knees, turning back toward the warmth of the hallway light. I saw him standing in the doorway, a dark silhouette against the glow of the house. He looked down at me, shivering in the downpour. There was no pity in his eyes. There was only relief. He slammed the heavy wooden door shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the night. Then came the sound that would haunt my nightmares for the next decade. Click, the deadbolt sliding home. I stared at the closed door, water dripping from my nose, mixing with the salt of my tears. I was 18, I was pregnant, and I was entirely alone in the dark. I pounded on the wood until my knuckles were raw, screaming for him to open up, but the house remained dark and silent. I realized with a sickening jolt that he wasn't coming back. The cold was turning my skin into ice, and I knew if I stayed on that porch I would freeze. I forced my legs to move, stepping off the concrete and into the mud of the front yard. I didn't look back at my bedroom window. I couldn't bear to see the life I was leaving behind. I started walking toward the only place in town that stayed open past midnight. The Greyhound station was 3 miles away. 3 miles doesn't sound like a lot until you're walking it in a torrential downpour with nothing but a soaking wet t-shirt on your back. My canvas sneakers were ruined within the first block. I could feel the water sloshing inside them, a gross, squelching sound accompanying every single step. Squelch, step, squelch, step. My jeans became heavy, clinging to my legs like lead weights dragging me down. Shivering became a violent, full-body convulsion that made my teeth chatter so hard I thought they might crack. Cars drove past me, their headlights blinding in the rain, spraying dirty water onto the sidewalk. I hugged myself tight, digging my fingernails into my arms, trying to preserve even a fraction of body heat. Nobody stopped. Nobody looked twice at the soaking wet girl stumbling along the shoulder of the highway. By the time the neon blue Greyhound sign flickered into view, I couldn't feel my toes. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and the change in atmosphere hit me like a physical wall. The air was dry and stale. It smelled intensely of industrial floor wax, old coffee, and the acrid tang of bus exhaust fumes. I dripped a puddle onto the linoleum floor immediately. The station was mostly empty, just a few tired travelers slumped in corners, guarding their luggage with weary eyes. I walked over to a row of metal seats near the back wall. I sat down and the cold, ribbed metal bit into my wet jeans, sending a fresh shock of chill up my spine. I didn't care, it was a roof. I pulled my knees up to my chest, trying to make myself as small as possible. My duffel bag was still on the porch. I had nothing. I rested my forehead against my knees and let out a shaky breath that rattled in my chest. Then instinctively my hand moved to my stomach. It was flat. There was no bump, no outward sign of the chaos that had just destroyed my life. But then I felt it. It was probably just my nerves or the adrenaline crashing, but I swore I felt a tiny flutter deep inside me. It wasn't a kick. It was softer than that. It felt like a secret promise. It was a reminder that I wasn't just Alina, the girl who got kicked out. I was a mother now. The realization was terrifying, but it also lit a tiny, fierce spark in the center of my freezing chest. I wasn't alone. I reached into the back pocket of my jeans, my fingers numb and clumsy. I pulled out a wad of damp cash I had made from babysitting the neighbor's kids last week. I smoothed the bills out on my wet thigh, counting them slowly. 1 5, 9 ones, $14. That was my entire net worth. $14 and a baby I had no way to feed. I looked up at the clock on the wall, watching the second hand tick relentlessly forward. The station manager was eyeing me from the ticket booth, his face sour. I knew I couldn't stay here forever. I stared out the window at the black, rainy night, clutching those $14 like a lifeline. When the sun came up, I would have to leave this bench. And when I did, I had absolutely nowhere to go. I'm Alina, 30 years old, and I went from a homeless teen to owning the largest logistics company in the state. The sun rose over the Greyhound station like a gray bruise on the horizon. The station manager didn't even have to speak. I saw him reach for the phone, his eyes locked on my shivering form. I knew he was calling the cops to clear out the vagrants. I stood up before he could dial the first digit. My jeans were still damp and stiff, chafing my raw skin with every step. I pushed back out into the morning mist, clutching my $14 in my pocket until my knuckles turned white. I walked until my legs felt like jelly. I walked until the buildings thinned out and the sleek city roads turned into cracked asphalt. That's when I saw it. The rusty rig. It was a 24-hour truck stop sitting on the edge of the highway like a dying beast. The neon sign was buzzing, missing the letter R, so it just read the Usty Rig. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't safe, but I saw a handwritten sign taped to the greasy glass door. Help wanted, dishwasher, cash. My heart leaped into my throat. I smoothed down my frizzy, water-damaged hair and took a deep breath. I walked inside. The smell hit me harder than the storm had the night before. It was a thick, suffocating wall of stale cigarette smoke, burnt coffee, and ancient fryer grease. My stomach, empty and sensitive from the pregnancy, did a violent somersault. I swallowed back the bile, forcing a smile onto my face. I walked straight up to the counter. A man with a stain on his apron and eyes that looked like they hadn't closed in a week looked me up and down. I'm here for the job, I said. My voice was raspy, but I made sure it didn't shake. He laughed, a dry, hacking sound. You look like a stiff breeze would knock you over, girl, he grunted. I'm stronger than I look, I lied. I'll work hard, I don't need breaks. He stared at me for a long, agonizing minute. He saw the desperation in my eyes. He saw that I was cheap labor with no other options. $6 an hour, he said, spitting into a cup. Under the table, you break it, you buy it. Deal, I said instantly. He threw a greasy apron at me. Start in the back, the fryers need scraping. That apron became my armor. I tied it tight, praying it would hide the secret growing inside me. I walked into the kitchen, and it was like walking into hell. The heat was oppressive, radiating off the industrial ovens in waves that distorted the air. I spent the next 12 hours bent over a sink the size of a bathtub. The water was scalding hot. The soap was harsh, chemical pink sludge that stripped the oils right off my hands. I scrubbed plates until my fingers were prunny and white. I scraped blackened grease off deep fryer baskets until my shoulders felt like they were on fire. The smell of old oil and diesel fumes seeped into my pores. I could taste it on the back of my tongue. Every hour, nausea would roll over me in a sickening wave. I would grit my teeth, breathing through my nose, terrified that if I threw up, he would fire me. He couldn't know. If he knew I was pregnant, I was a liability. If he knew I was carrying the burden my father had discarded, I would be back on the street. So I worked. I worked until my feet swelled inside my ruined sneakers. I worked until the ache in my lower back turned into a sharp, stabbing scream. I learned to carry heavy crates of frozen fries by propping them against my hips, keeping the weight off my stomach. I wore oversized flannel shirts I found in the lost and found bin, layering them even in the stifling heat. I was drowning in sweat. My skin broke out in painful red cystic acne from the grease in the air. I looked in the cracked mirror of the employee bathroom during my one allowed break. I didn't recognize the girl staring back. Her eyes were dark and hollow. Her skin was gray, but her jaw was set in a line of pure granite. I touched my stomach through the thick fabric of the stolen flannel. "I've got you," I whispered to the tiny life inside me. "I don't know how, but I've got you." At the end of the shift, the manager tossed three $20 bills onto the counter. I grabbed them like they were gold bullion. $60. It was enough for a cheap motel room down the road and a sandwich. I walked out into the cool night air, my body screaming in protest, reeking of French fries and desperation. I had survived day one. But as I walked toward the motel, clutching my cash, I saw a police cruiser roll slowly through the parking lot. My heart stopped. I ducked my head, pulling my collar up. I wasn't a criminal, but I was a runaway in the eyes of the world. And I knew my father. He might have kicked me out, but he was a man of reputation. If he decided to report me missing just to save face, I was done for. I hurried into the shadows, the fear of discovery chilling me more than the night air. I had a job. I had $60. But I was still hunting for a place to feel safe, and the hunt was far from over. I'm Elena, 30 years old, and I went from a homeless teen to owning the largest logistics company in the state. The bleach fumes were searing the inside of my nose. I was on my knees on the cracked tile floor of the women's bathroom at the truck stop. My belly was a heavy, swollen beach ball pressing against my thighs. I had managed to hide it for months under oversized flannels and a grease-stained apron. But at 39 weeks, there was no hiding the truth. I scrubbed the porcelain rim of the toilet, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. My back ached with a dull, throbbing rhythm that I had been ignoring for 6 hours. I dipped the brush back into the bucket of blue chemical water. Then it hit me. It wasn't a cramp, it was a lightning strike. A white-hot agony ripped through my lower abdomen, seizing my entire body in a vice grip. I dropped the brush. It clattered loudly against the tiles, splashing harsh chemicals onto my cheek. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I clutched the rim of the toilet bowl, my knuckles turning white as the room spun violently around me. A low, guttural groan escaped my throat before I could stop it. The pain came in a wave so intense it felt like my hips were being pulled apart by horses. "Hey, you almost done in there?" The manager's voice boomed from the hallway. I tried to answer. I tried to say almost, but all that came out was a strangled sob. I felt a pop. Warm fluid gushed down my legs, soaking my jeans, mixing with the dirty water on the floor. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the pain. I had broken the rule. I was making a mess. I was going to get fired. The door swung open, hitting the stall partition. The manager stood there, his face twisting from annoyance to horror as he saw me curled in a puddle of water and fluids. "Oh, hell no," he muttered. He didn't help me up. He didn't ask if I was okay. He backed away as if I were radioactive. "I'm calling 911, he yelled, retreating toward the kitchen. "Don't you have that baby on my floor." The next hour was a blur of siren wails and potholes. I lay strapped to a gurney, staring up at the roof of the ambulance. Every bump in the road sent a shockwave of torture through my spine. The paramedic was young, looking at me with a mix of pity and judgment. He asked me where the father was. I gritted my teeth and looked away. "There is no father," I whispered between contractions. "Just me." They wheeled me into the city hospital, bypassing the nice rooms with the private TVs. They rolled me straight into the charity ward. It was a large, open room separated only by thin, flimsy curtains that did nothing to block the sound. The air smelled sharp and aggressive, rubbing alcohol, stale urine, and the metallic tang of blood. To my left, a woman was screaming in Spanish. To my right, monitors were beeping incessantly. I was alone. No husband holding my hand. No mother wiping my forehead with a cool cloth. Just me shivering in a thin hospital gown that didn't close all the way in the back. The labor was brutal. It felt like I was being turned inside out. A nurse with tired eyes and rough hands checked me. "You're 10 centimeters," she said flatly, snapping her gum. "Time to push." I grabbed the metal rails of the bed. The iron was cold against my sweating palms. "Push," she commanded. I screamed. I screamed out the fear of the last 9 months. I screamed out the anger at my father for throwing me away like trash. I screamed out the terror of having $14 to my name. The pain reached a crescendo, a blinding white light that threatened to swallow me whole. And then relief, a sudden, slippery release. The room went silent for a heartbeat. Then a high-pitched, indignant wail cut through the noise of the ward. "It's a boy," the nurse said, her voice softening just a fraction. She wiped him down quickly and placed him on my chest. He was tiny. He was red and wrinkled and covered in white vernix. But he was warm. He was a heavy, living heat against my skin. I looked down at him. His eyes were squeezed shut, his tiny fists flailing against the air. My heart hammered against his small rib cage. I waited for the fear to return. I waited to feel the crushing weight of poverty, the panic of homelessness. But instead, I felt something else. I felt a sudden, terrifying clarity. It was like liquid steel pouring into my veins, hardening instantly. I touched his damp hair with a trembling finger. "Leo," I whispered, "your name is Leo." The nurse was saying something about paperwork, about social services, but I tuned her out. I looked at the peeling paint on the ceiling. I listened to the chaos of the charity ward around me. I pulled Leo closer, wrapping my arms around him like a fortress. My father had called this baby a mistake. He had called him a burden. He had destroyed our family because of this tiny, helpless creature. I felt a cold, hard iron settle deep in my heart. The fear evaporated, replaced by a ruthless determination. "You are not a mistake," I whispered into his ear, my voice fierce and low. "You are not a burden." I kissed his forehead, tasting the salt of my own sweat. "They kicked us out, Leo. They threw us away." I stared at the wall, my eyes burning. "But I'm going to build a world so big, so strong, that nobody will ever dare to kick you out again." I wasn't just a teenage runaway anymore. I wasn't just a dishwasher. I was a mother. And for the first time in my life, I knew exactly what I had to do. I had to conquer the world. And I only had $14 to start. I'm Alina, 30 years old, and I went from a homeless teen to owning the largest logistics company in the state. The apartment wasn't really an apartment. It was a concrete box buried 6 feet underground. The landlord, a man with grease under his fingernails and eyes that lingered too long on my chest, took my cash without a receipt. He told me not to complain about the dampness. I didn't complain. I couldn't afford to complain. I walked down the 3 steep steps, clutching Leo to my chest, and locked the hollow plywood door behind me. The air smelled like wet earth and mildew. Condensation slicked the painted cinderblock walls, glistening like sweat in the dim light. There was one window. It was a narrow rectangle high up on the wall, level with the sidewalk outside. All it showed was a view of a dirty brick wall and the occasional pair of boots walking past. I set Leo down. I didn't have a crib. I didn't have a changing table. I had a blue plastic laundry basket I had bought at the dollar store. I lined it with the softest blankets I owned, my old flannel shirts washed until they were threadbare. I placed him gently inside. He was so small. He curled his tiny fists against his cheeks and let out a soft, milky sigh. He slept peacefully, unaware that his nursery was a damp basement, unaware that his mother was terrified. I turned away from him and looked at my weapon. It sat on a wobbly card table I had salvaged from the curb on trash day. It was a laptop. It was thick, heavy, and missing the F key. I had pawned a gold locket, the only thing my mother had left me before she died, to buy it. It cost me $70. It was the biggest gamble of my life. I pulled up a metal folding chair and sat down. The metal was cold against my legs. I opened the lid. The screen flickered to life, casting a ghostly blue glow across the dark room. I didn't turn on the overhead light. I was trying to save on the electric bill, so I lived in the blue light. I cracked my knuckles. They were red and raw from scrubbing floors at a diner during the day, a job I had picked up to keep us fed while I plotted our escape. But this machine was the escape. I navigated to a free coding academy website. I didn't have the luxury of college. I didn't have the luxury of time. I had to learn a language that paid. I typed, "Print, hello, world." The text appeared on the screen. It was simple, it was stupid, but it was control. For the first time since my father threw my bags onto the driveway, I was controlling something. I dove in. I spent my nights drowning in Python and SQL. My eyes burned. They felt like someone had rubbed sand into my corneas. I blinked hard, trying to clear the blurriness, but the code kept swimming. I reached for my mug. It was filled with lukewarm instant coffee made with tap water because I couldn't afford milk. I took a sip. It tasted like battery acid. But the caffeine hit my bloodstream like a jolt of electricity, forcing my eyelids to stay open. I looked at the clock in the corner of the screen. 3:14 a.m. I had to be up at 6:00 a.m. for the diner shift. My body was screaming at me. My back ached from the cheap chair. My breasts were heavy and painful, needing to pump, but I ignored the discomfort. I couldn't stop. I looked over at the laundry basket. Leo shifted in his sleep, a tiny hand reaching up to grasp the air. Panic tightened my throat. I checked my bank account balance in a separate tab. $42.18. That was it. That was diapers. That was formula if my milk dried up from stress. That was rent in 2 weeks. The number mocked me. It whispered that I was failing him. It whispered that my father was right. I felt the tears prick at the corners of my eyes, hot and stinging. "No," I whispered to the empty room. I slammed the coffee mug down on the table. The liquid sloshed over the rim, staining the wood. I wasn't going to cry. Crying didn't pay the rent. Crying didn't buy diapers. Code did. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand and turned back to the screen. I was building a portfolio. I was building a small script to automate inventory for a mock warehouse. I didn't know it then, but I was building the foundation of my empire. I typed faster. The clicking of the keys was the only sound in the room, a rhythmic, desperate percussion. If variable X is greater than supply Y. I wasn't just typing characters, I was weaving a safety net. I was knitting a future where Leo would never have to sleep in a laundry basket again. The fan on the old laptop whirred loudly, struggling to keep up with me. It sounded like it was going to take flight. "Come on," I muttered, my voice cracking from disuse. "Stay with me." The screen flickered again. For a second, the blue light died. Pitch blackness swallowed the room. My heart stopped. I held my breath, my hands hovering over the silent keyboard. Please, please don't die. If this laptop died, I died. A second passed, then two. Then, with a stuttering buzz, the screen flared back to life. The code was still there. I let out a breath that was half sob, half laugh. I leaned forward, my nose inches from the pixels, bathing in the artificial glow. I looked at the reflection in the dark glass of the screen. I saw a girl with dark circles under her eyes, hair matted and unwashed, wearing a stained t-shirt. But I looked closer. I saw the fire in her eyes. It was a cold blue fire. I wasn't just a mother, I was a machine. I typed until the sun began to bleed gray light through the window well. I typed until my fingers cramped into claws. I had survived the night. And I had learned one more function, one step closer to the summit. I closed the laptop, stood up on shaking legs, and walked to the laundry basket. I picked up my son. "Good morning, Leo," I whispered, kissing his soft, warm forehead. "Mommy's tired." I held him tight. "But Mommy's winning." I'm Alina, 30 years old, and I went from a homeless teen to owning the largest logistics company in the state. I sat in the blue glow of the monitor, my breath hitching in my throat. The basement was freezing. My fingers were stiff, hovering over the enter key. I had spent 6 months building this. 6 months of stealing Wi-Fi from the coffee shop upstairs. 6 months of writing code while Leo napped in his laundry basket. It was a routing algorithm. It was designed to solve the traveling salesman problem for local couriers. It was supposed to calculate the most efficient route for 50 deliveries in under 10 seconds. Every time I had run it before, it crashed. It threw error codes that looked like angry red scars across the screen. But tonight, I had rewritten the core logic. I had stripped it down to the bone. I looked at Leo. He was 18 months old now. He was outgrowing the basket. He needed shoes. He needed a life that didn't smell like mildew. I closed my eyes. "Please," I whispered to the universe. I pressed the key. I opened one eye. The screen didn't flash red. A green progress bar appeared. It filled up rapidly. Processing, processing, optimization complete. A list of addresses appeared, perfectly ordered by distance and traffic patterns. Total estimated time saved, 42 minutes per driver. I stared at the number. I felt a jolt of electricity run through my spine, sharper and hotter than the coffee I lived on. It worked. It actually worked. I didn't scream. I didn't dance. I quietly closed the laptop, my heart thundering against my ribs like a war drum. The next morning, I put on my only button-down shirt. It was frayed at the cuffs, but I ironed it until it was crisp. I took Leo to a neighbor, a sweet old lady who charged me $5 an hour to watch him. It was money I didn't have, but I had to make this meeting. I walked 3 miles to the industrial district. The air smelled of diesel fumes and burning rubber. I walked into the office of City Dash Couriers. It was a chaotic room filled with shouting dispatchers and ringing phones. The owner, Mr. Miller, looked at me like I was a lost child. "I'm not hiring drivers," he grunted, not looking up from his clipboard. "I'm not here to drive," I said, my voice shaking just a little. I pulled out my laptop. "I'm here to save you money on gas." He laughed, but he let me show him. I plugged in his daily manifest. I hit run. 5 seconds later, the route appeared. He stopped laughing. He looked at his current route sheet, then at my screen. He pulled out a calculator. His thick fingers punched in numbers. He did the math on the gas. He did the math on the driver overtime. He looked at me, really looked at me for the first time. "Who are you?" he asked. "I'm the solution," I said. I walked out of that office 20 minutes later. I was holding a check. It was a cashier's check for $5,000. I stood on the cracked sidewalk outside the warehouse. The sun was beating down on my face. I looked at the piece of paper in my hands. $5,000. It was more money than I had ever seen in my life. It was a fortune. It was $1 billion to a girl who had lived on ramen for 3 years. My stomach growled. I walked past a bakery. The smell of fresh bread and vanilla hit me. I wanted to go in. I wanted to buy a cake. I wanted to buy Leo a mountain of toys. I wanted to buy myself a coat that actually zipped up. I stood there for a long time, clutching the check until the edges dampened with my sweat. "No," I said aloud. I turned away from the bakery. I walked to the bank. I deposited the check. I didn't spend a cent on myself. I didn't buy the cake. I went straight to the library and filed for an LLC. I paid the registration fees. I bought a domain name. I bought a server subscription. I was investing in the machine. 3 days later, I packed our things. It didn't take long. We fit everything we owned into 2 trash bags and the laundry basket. I carried Leo up the basement steps. I unlocked the door to our new place. It was a studio apartment on the 3rd floor. It was small, the carpet was brown and ugly. The appliances were from the 80s, but I looked up. The ceiling was white, it was dry, there were no water stains. There was a window that looked out at the sky, not a brick wall. I set Leo down on the carpet. He giggled and ran toward the window, pointing at a bird flying past. "Bird," he squealed. I sat down in the middle of the empty room. The floor was solid beneath me. I took a deep breath. The air didn't smell like earth. It smelled like lemon, pledge, and possibility. I had sold the rights to the code for one company, but I kept the ownership of the underlying logic. I had $5,000 less in my account than I wanted, but I had a registered business. I wasn't just Alina the runaway anymore. I wasn't just the girl who got knocked up and kicked out. I was the CEO of a company that existed on paper and in my head. I watched Leo press his nose against the glass. My father had said I would end up in the gutter. I looked at the clean, dry ceiling. The gutter was below us now, and we were never going back down. I'm Alina, 30 years old, and I am the CEO of a $500 million logistics empire that moves the world while I stay perfectly still. I stopped being a person somewhere around year 3. I became a function. I became a ghost in a tailored suit. For 7 years, I didn't date. I didn't take vacations. I didn't go to the movies. I worked 20 hours a day. I traded sleep for market share. I traded happiness for leverage. The studio apartment with the brown carpet turned into a 2-bedroom condo, then a penthouse, then an estate with gates high enough to keep out everything except the silence. I remember sitting in a boardroom in Chicago. It was year 4. The table was mahogany, long enough to land a plane on. Across from me sat 3 men in gray suits. They owned a mid-sized trucking fleet I needed to acquire. They looked at me. They saw a woman in her mid-20s. They saw soft skin. They saw prey. "Listen, sweetheart," the CEO said, leaning back in his leather chair. "Your offer is cute, but we're not selling for anything less than $20 million." He smiled. It was a condescending, oily smile. I didn't smile back. I didn't blink. I tapped the tablet in front of me. "I know your fleet is aging," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The room went quiet. "I know your maintenance costs have risen 40% in the last 2 quarters." The smile faltered. "I know you just lost the Amazon contract because your on-time delivery rate dropped below 92%. He sat up straighter. "And I know," I continued, leaning forward just an inch, "that your bank is calling in your loan on Tuesday." The air left the room. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. I could smell his fear. It smelled like stale tobacco and desperation. "You don't have until Tuesday," I said. "You have until I walk out that door." I stood up. I smoothed the front of my jacket. $15 million, I said. "Asset purchase, cash." I took 1 step toward the door. "Wait," he choked out. I stopped. I didn't turn around. "We'll take it." I walked out of the building. I sat in the back of my black car. My hands weren't shaking anymore. The fire in my chest had turned into ice. I checked my phone. My bank account balance stared back at me. $18,450,210. It was just a number. It didn't make me happy. It made me safe. It was a wall. Every zero I added was another brick in the fortress I was building around Leo. Leo was in private school now. He wore uniforms that cost more than my old car. He took fencing lessons. He played the cello. I saw him for an hour in the mornings and an hour before bed. It killed me. The guilt sat in my stomach like a stone, heavy and cold. But then I would remember the laundry basket. I would remember the mildew. And I would go back to work. I revolutionized the industry. My code, that little script I wrote in a basement, had evolved into Nexus. It was an AI that predicted supply chain disruptions before they happened. If a hurricane formed in the Atlantic, my trucks were already rerouting in Ohio. If a strike happened in a port in China, my warehouses in Texas were already adjusting inventory. I controlled the flow. I was the invisible hand moving goods across the continent. But there was one thing I couldn't control. One variable I couldn't optimize. It was the first of the month. I was in my office on the 42nd floor. The city of Seattle lay spread out beneath me, a grid of lights in the rain. My assistant, a sharp woman named Sarah, walked in. She placed a single manila envelope on my glass desk. "From the agency," she said softly. She left. I stared at the envelope. It had no return address, just my name typed in bold ink. I kept a private investigator on retainer, $5,000 a month. His only job was to watch a small, peeling house in a dead-end town 3 states away. His only job was to watch my father. My hand hovered over the paper, my heart rate spiked. For 7 years I had never called, I had never visited, I was dead to him. But he wasn't dead to me. I needed to know. I needed to know he was still miserable. I needed to know he was still small. I slid a silver letter opener under the flap. The sound of tearing paper was loud in the silent office. I pulled out the report. There were photos. Grainy, long lens shots taken from a parked car. I picked up the first one. It was him. He was standing on the porch. He looked older, so much older. His hair was white and thinning. His shoulders were slumped as if the weight of the sky was crushing him. He was holding a beer can, the same brand. The porch railing was still broken. The siding was still gray and rotting. I flipped to the written report. Subject: employment status, unemployed, laid off from the mill 6 months ago. Subject: health, high blood pressure, signs of liver distress. Subject: financial status, 3 months behind on mortgage. Foreclosure imminent. I read the words again. Foreclosure imminent. The man who had thrown me out for being a burden was about to lose the roof over his own head. I felt a surge of triumph. It was hot and vicious. It tasted like copper. He was failing. I was winning. I was sitting in a chair that cost more than his car, looking at the ruin of his life. But then I looked at the next photo. He was sitting on the porch steps, his head in his hands. He looked small. He didn't look like the monster who had screamed at me. He looked like a defeated old man. I put the photo down. My fingers were trembling, not from fear, from rage. He didn't get to just fade away. He didn't get to just lose the house to a bank and disappear. That was too easy. That was too quiet. I wanted him to know. I wanted him to see me. I wanted him to see the mistake. I picked up my phone. I dialed my CFO. "Elena," he answered, surprised. "It's midnight. I need you to buy something for me," I said. "Okay, what are we buying? Another fleet, a warehouse?" I looked at the address on the report. 1402 Oak Street. The house where I grew up. The house where I learned to be afraid. "No," I said. "I want to buy a mortgage." "Whose mortgage?" "My father's." There was a silence on the line. "Elena, we don't buy residential debt." "I'm not asking the company to buy it," I said, my voice steady as steel. "I'm buying it, personally." "Why?" I looked at my reflection in the window. I looked flawless. I looked dangerous. "Because I'm going to evict the tenant." I'm Alina, 30 years old, and I am the CEO of a $500 million logistics empire that moves the world while I stay perfectly still. I stopped being a human being somewhere around year 3 of my company's existence. I became a function. I became a ghost in a tailored suit. For 7 years, I didn't date, I didn't take vacations, and I certainly didn't go home. I worked 20 hours a day. I traded sleep for market share. I traded happiness for leverage. The studio apartment with the brown carpet and the single window turned into a 2-bedroom condo, then a penthouse, then an estate with gates high enough to keep out everything except the silence. I remember the exact moment I hardened completely. It was year 4. I was sitting in a boardroom in Chicago, the mahogany table long enough to land a plane on. Across from me sat 3 men in gray suits who owned a mid-sized trucking fleet I needed to acquire. They looked at me and saw a woman in her mid-20s. They saw soft skin, they saw prey. "Listen, sweetheart," the CEO said, leaning back in his leather chair with a condescending, oily smile. "Your offer is cute, but we're not selling for anything less than 20 million. I didn't smile back. I didn't blink. I tapped the tablet in front of me. "I know your fleet is aging," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The room went quiet. "I know your maintenance costs have risen 40% in the last 2 quarters because you deferred repairs to pad your EBITDA." The smile faltered. "I know you just lost the Amazon contract because your on-time delivery rate dropped below 92%. He sat up straighter. "And I know," I continued, leaning forward just an inch, "that the bank is calling in your operating line of credit on Tuesday." The air left the room. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning and the ticking of the expensive watch on his wrist. I could smell his fear. It smelled like stale tobacco and desperation. "You don't have until Tuesday," I said. "You have until I walk out that door." I stood up and smoothed the front of my jacket. 15 million asset purchase, cash. I took one step toward the door. "Wait," he choked out. I stopped, but I didn't turn around. "We'll take it." I walked out of the building and sat in the back of my black car. My hands weren't shaking anymore. The fire in my chest that used to burn with anxiety had turned into ice. I checked my phone. My bank account balance stared back at me, $18,450,210. It was just a number. It didn't make me happy. It made me safe. Every zero I added was another brick in the fortress I was building around my son, Leo. Leo was in private school now, wearing uniforms that cost more than my first car, taking fencing lessons and playing the cello. I saw him for an hour in the mornings and an hour before bed. It killed me. The guilt sat in my stomach like a stone, heavy and cold, but then I would remember the laundry basket and the mildew of the basement I ran from. And I would go back to work. I revolutionized the industry. My code, that little script I wrote in a basement while pregnant and terrified, had evolved into Nexus. It was an AI that predicted supply chain disruptions before they happened. I controlled the flow. I was the invisible hand moving goods across the continent. But there was one thing I couldn't control, one variable I couldn't optimize. It was the first of the month. I was in my office on the 42nd floor, the city of Seattle spread out beneath me like a grid of diamonds on black velvet. My assistant, Sarah, walked in and placed a single manila envelope on my glass desk. "From the agency," she said softly. She left. I stared at the envelope. It had no return address, just my name typed in bold ink. I kept a private investigator on retainer for $5,000 a month. His only job was to watch a small, peeling house in a dead-end town 3 states away. His only job was to watch my father. My hand hovered over the paper and my heart rate spiked. For 7 years I had never called, never visited, never sent a Christmas card. I was dead to him, but he wasn't dead to me. I needed to know he was still miserable. I needed to know he was still small. I slid a silver letter opener under the flap. The sound of tearing paper was loud in the silent office. I pulled out the report. There were photos, grainy, long lens shots taken from a parked car. I picked up the first one. It was him. He was standing on the porch. He looked older, so much older. His hair was white and thinning, and his shoulders were slumped as if the weight of the sky was finally crushing him. He was holding a beer can, the same cheap brand he drank the night he threw me out. The porch railing was still broken. The siding was still gray and rotting. I flipped to the written report. Subject: employment status, unemployed. The local manufacturing plant has officially ceased operations. Chapter 7: Liquidation. I paused. The plant, that place was his kingdom. It was where he got his paycheck, his pride, and his entitlement. It was gone. I read the next line. Subject: financial status, 3 months behind on mortgage. Bank has initiated foreclosure proceedings. Auction scheduled for the 15th. I read the words again. Foreclosure imminent. The man who had thrown me out for being a burden was about to lose the roof over his own head. I waited for the pity to come. I waited to feel sad for the old man sitting on the rotting porch, but I felt nothing. Actually, that's a lie. I felt a surge of triumph so hot and vicious it tasted like copper in my mouth. He was failing. I was winning. I was sitting in a chair that cost more than his entire life savings, looking at the ruin of his world. I picked up the next photo. He was sitting on the porch steps, his head in his hands. He looked defeated. He didn't look like the monster who had screamed that I was a mistake. He looked like a victim of a changing world. I put the photo down. My fingers were trembling, not from fear, from rage. He didn't get to just fade away. He didn't get to just lose the house to a bank algorithm and disappear into the ether. That was too easy. That was too quiet. I wanted him to know. I wanted him to see me. I wanted him to see the mistake holding the deed to his life. I picked up my phone and dialed my CFO. Elena, he answered, surprised. It's midnight. I need you to execute a purchase for me, I said. Okay, what are we buying? Another fleet, a warehouse in Ohio. I looked at the address on the report. 1402 Oak Street, the house where I grew up, the house where I learned to be afraid of footsteps in the hallway. No, I said, I want to buy a mortgage. Whose mortgage? My father's. There was a silence on the line. Elena, we don't buy distressed residential debt. It's not in our portfolio strategy. I'm not asking the company to buy it, I said, my voice steady as steel. I'm buying it, personally. Use the anonymous trust. Why? I looked at my reflection in the window. I looked flawless. I looked dangerous. Because I'm going to evict the tenant. I'm Elena, 30 years old, and I hold the deed to my father's house in my Valentino handbag. I turned the wheel of the black Range Rover. The tires left the pavement and hit the gravel. Crunch. The sound was violent. It was the exact same sound I heard 12 years ago, the night I left with a trash bag of clothes and a baby growing inside me. Back then, the sound of gravel meant exile. Today, it sounded like a gavel coming down. I put the car in park. I didn't turn off the engine immediately. I sat there, gripping the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The air conditioning hummed, blowing cool, filtered air against my face, but I felt hot. I felt a phantom heat rising up my neck. It was the memory of shame. I looked out the tinted window. The house sat there like a rotting tooth in a dying jaw. The siding, once white, was now a bruised shade of gray. The gutters hung loose, choked with dead leaves. The front lawn was knee-high, a jungle of dandelion and crabgrass that had long ago surrendered to neglect. It looked small. That was the first thing that shocked me. In my nightmares, this house was a fortress. In my memory, it was a towering monument to my father's authority. But sitting here through the lens of a woman who managed global supply chains and negotiated 8-figure contracts, it was just a shack. I killed the engine. Silence rushed into the car. I took a breath. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyeliner was sharp enough to cut glass. My lipstick was a deep blood red. I looked perfect. I looked untouchable. I opened the door and stepped out. The humidity of the Midwest summer hit me instantly, heavy and smelling of wet earth and pine. My stiletto heel sank an inch into the soft dirt of the driveway. I didn't care. I walked toward the porch. The wood steps groaned under my weight. I remembered the third step was loose. My body remembered it before my brain did. I automatically stepped over it. I stood at the front door. The screen door was torn, the mesh flapping in the slight breeze like a surrendered flag. I reached for the handle. I expected it to be locked. I expected him to be barricaded inside, hiding from the creditors and the shame. But the knob turned in my hand. It was unlocked. Of course it was. He had nothing left to steal. I pushed the door open. The smell hit me first. It was a smell I had spent thousands of dollars on therapy trying to scrub from my sensory memory. Stale beer, old grease, and the distinct, damp musk of a house that hasn't seen joy in a decade. I stepped onto the linoleum of the entryway. It was peeling at the corners, curling up to reveal the subfloor beneath. "Who's there?" The voice came from the kitchen. It was gravelly and wet. It sounded old. My heart slammed against my ribs. For a second, just a split second, I was 18 again. For a second, I wanted to turn around and run back to the safety of my car, back to my penthouse in Seattle, back to the life where I was the boss. But I forced my feet to move. Click, click, click. My heels on the floorboards sounded like gunshots in the quiet house. I walked down the hallway. The walls were bare. There were no pictures. There used to be pictures of my mother, pictures of me winning the spelling bee, pictures of us on a fishing trip. Now there were just rectangular outlines of dust where the frames used to hang. He had erased us. I reached the doorway of the kitchen. The blinds were drawn, slicing the afternoon sun into thin, dusty strips on the table. He was sitting there. He was wearing a stained undershirt and jeans that hung loose on his wasted frame. There was a half-empty bottle of whiskey in front of him and a stack of unopened envelopes. Bills, final notices, threats. He didn't look up immediately. He was staring into the amber liquid in his glass as if the answers to his failures were floating at the bottom. "I told you people," he mumbled, his voice thick. "I don't have it. You can take the truck. It's dead anyway." He thought I was a debt collector. He thought I was just another vulture coming to pick at the carcass of his life. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, a silhouette in a tailored Italian suit, blocking the light from the hallway. He sensed the silence. He slowly lifted his head. His eyes were cloudy, rimmed with red, swimming in a haze of alcohol and self-pity. He squinted at me. He looked at my shoes. He looked at the sharp crease of my trousers. He looked at the silk blouse and the structured blazer. He didn't see me. He saw money. He saw power. He saw everything he wasn't. "If you're from the bank," he spat, trying to summon a shred of his old aggression, "you're wasting your time. I ain't leaving." I walked forward. I pulled out a chair, the same chair I sat in when he told me I was a whore, the same chair I sat in when he told me to get an abortion or get out. I sat down across from him. I placed my handbag on the sticky table. I folded my hands. "You are leaving," I said. My voice was calm. It was the voice I used when I fired incompetent managers. It was smooth, cold, and final. He froze. His eyes widened. The glass trembled in his hand, the ice cubes clinking together. He knew that voice. It was deeper now, refined by boardrooms and public speaking, but the cadence was the same. He leaned forward, squinting harder, trying to reconcile the image of the powerful woman in front of him with the memory of the crying girl he threw away. "Alina," he whispered. It came out as a question, as if it were impossible. "Hello, Dad." He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. "You," he started, then stopped. He looked me up and down again, his brain misfiring. "You look expensive." "I am," I said. He let out a short, dry laugh that turned into a cough. "Come to gloat," he asked, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Come to see the old man drown? No, I said. I reached into my bag. I pulled out the thick document with the blue cover. I slid it across the table. It stopped right next to his whiskey glass. What's this? He asked, eyeing the paper like it was a bomb. It's the deed to the house, I said. Hope flickered in his eyes. It was pathetic to watch. He thought I was saving him. He thought I was the prodigal daughter returning to pay off his sins with my checkbook. You paid it, he asked, his voice trembling with relief. You paid the bank. I bought the debt, I corrected him. Right, he said, a jagged smile breaking across his face. Family, I knew you'd come back. I knew you wouldn't let them take the house. We're blood, Alina. Blood is thicker than water. I watched him. I watched him rewrite history in real time. I watched him forget the night he dragged me down the hallway. I watched him forget the night he called my unborn son a parasite. Open it, I said. He fumbled with the cover, his hands shaking. He flipped to the last page. It's all legalese, he muttered. What does it mean? It means we're clear, right? Read paragraph 4, I said. He squinted, bringing the paper closer to his face. He moved his lips as he read the words. Notice to vacate. Eviction proceedings. 72 hours. He stopped reading. The color drained from his face, leaving it the color of old ash. He looked up at me. The hope was gone, replaced by confusion, and then fear. What is this? He whispered. I own the mortgage now, I said, leaning forward. Which means I own the house, and I have zero tolerance for non-paying tenants. You can't do this, he stammered. I'm your father. You stopped being my father the night you threw a pregnant teenager into the snow, I said. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I stated it as a fact, like a delivery schedule or a quarterly projection. That was a long time ago, he said, his voice rising. I was trying to teach you a lesson. I was trying to make you tough. It worked, I said. I stood up. I towered over him. You have 3 days, I said. If you're not out, the sheriff will remove you, and unlike you, I won't wait until it's snowing. Where am I supposed to go? He shouted, slamming his hand on the table. I have nowhere. I looked at him. I looked at the man who created me and then tried to destroy me. I picked up my bag. I suggest you figure it out, I said, just like I did. I turned around and walked toward the door. Alina, he screamed after me. Alina, you can't do this. You're my daughter. I walked down the hallway. I walked past the ghosts. I walked past the fear. I stepped out onto the porch and into the blinding sunlight. I walked to my car, the gravel crunching beneath my feet. I got in. I started the engine. I didn't look back. I'm Alina, 30 years old, and I went from a homeless teen mom to the CEO of the largest logistics firm in the state. I sat in the driver's seat of my luxury sedan, my knuckles white against the leather steering wheel. The engine purred beneath me, a low, powerful vibration that usually calmed my nerves. But today my heart was racing like a trapped bird. I had just walked out of that house. I had just handed my father an eviction notice. I had left him sobbing in his kitchen, broken and defeated. It was exactly what I had planned for 12 years. It was exactly what I thought I wanted. But as I stared through the windshield at the overgrown lawn, I felt hollow. Leaving him to rot didn't make the past disappear. Crushing him didn't heal the 18-year-old girl he'd thrown into the snow. I looked to the passenger seat. Leo was sitting there. He was 12 years old now, his long legs cramped in the footwell, a book resting on his lap. He looked up at me with dark, perceptive eyes, eyes that were terrifyingly similar to the man sitting inside that house. Is it done? Leo asked softly. His voice was cracking, hovering somewhere between childhood and the deep baritone of a man. I looked at my son. He was the mistake. He was the parasite my father had screamed about, and he was brilliant. He was kind. He was the best thing I had ever done. I realized then that simply destroying my father wasn't a victory. It was just revenge, and I was better than that. Not yet, I said. I turned off the engine. Silence rushed back into the car. I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out the second folder, the blue one, the one my lawyer had called excessively generous. Come with me, I told Leo. He didn't argue, he trusted me completely. We got out of the car. The sun had broken through the storm clouds, baking the wet asphalt of the driveway. The heat radiated up through the soles of my stilettos. We walked up the porch steps. The wood groaned under our weight. I pushed the front door open again. The house was quiet now. The sobbing had stopped. We walked down the hallway, the floorboards creaking in rhythm with my heartbeat. My father was still at the kitchen table. He was staring at the eviction notice I had left, his face gray and slack. He looked up when we entered. His eyes were red, rimmed with exhaustion and fear. You came back, he whispered, his voice trembling. You came back to gloat? No, I said, I came to introduce you. I stepped aside. I put a hand on Leo's shoulder and guided him forward. The air left the room. My father stared. He stopped breathing. He was looking at a ghost. He was looking at himself from 50 years ago. Leo was tall, lanky, but broad-shouldered, with the same jawline, the same unruly hair. The disgrace. The end of the family line. Here he was, standing in a crisp polo shirt and clean chinos, looking like the future my father had thrown away. This is Leo, I said. My voice was steady, sharp enough to cut glass. Leo, my father breathed. He started to stand up, his hand reaching out instinctively, his fingers trembling. Leo didn't flinch. He just watched the old man, cool and analytical. Sit down, I commanded. My father sank back into his chair as if the strings had been cut. He couldn't take his eyes off the boy. He's big, my father stammered. He's brilliant, I corrected him. He's top of his class, he plays cello, he speaks 3 languages, and he is the grandson you never met. My father wiped his face with a shaking hand. Alina, save it, I cut him off. I walked to the table. I picked up the eviction notice. I ripped it in half. The sound of tearing paper was violent in the quiet kitchen. I ripped it again and again. I let the pieces flutter down onto the sticky table like snow. My father looked up at me, confusion warring with a desperate sliver of hope. I don't understand, he said. I slapped the blue folder onto the table. I flipped it open. This is an employment contract, I said. He blinked, his brain struggling to catch up. Employment? My company owns a distribution center 10 miles from here, I said. We need night shift security. It pays $22 an hour. Full benefits, dental, vision. I tapped the paper with my manicured nail. You take the job, I said. You show up on time, you stay sober on the clock. I flipped the page. And this, I said, pointing to the second document, is a lease agreement. A lease. I own the house now, I said, but you can stay. His jaw dropped. I can stay. Your rent is deducted directly from your paycheck, I said. It leaves you with enough for food and utilities. Nothing more, no money for whiskey. I leaned in close. I could smell the sour fear on him. You work for me now, I said. You earn your keep. That is the only way you stay under this roof. He looked at the contract, then he looked at Leo, then he looked at me. He started to cry again, but these weren't tears of self-pity. They were the tears of a man who had been given a life raft he didn't deserve. Why? He choked out. After everything I did to you, I threw you out in the cold. I looked at my son. Leo was watching me, his eyes shining with pride. Because I'm not you, I said. I pulled a pen from my purse and set it on the document. Sign it, I said, or get out. He grabbed the pen like a lifeline. His hand shook so badly he could barely form the letters. He signed his name. He signed away his authority. He accepted my grace. I took the folder back. Report to the site manager on Monday at 6 p.m., I said. Don't make me regret this. I turned to Leo. Let's go. We walked out of the kitchen. We didn't say goodbye. We walked down the dark hallway past the peeling wallpaper and the ghosts of my childhood. We stepped out onto the porch. The sunlight hit us bright and blinding. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, clean and new. I walked to the car, my heels crunching on the gravel. I didn't feel heavy anymore. I felt light. I got in the driver's seat. Leo buckled his seatbelt. He looked at me. "You're a badass, Mom," he said quietly. I smiled. A real smile. "I know," I said. I put the car in drive. I pulled out of the driveway, leaving the rotting house and the broken man in the rearview mirror. I didn't look back. I drove toward the highway. I drove toward the city. I drove toward our future.